What would it mean if, in just 12 months, scientists basically introduced us to 1,121 new neighbors? Not out in space, and not in some hidden rainforest, right here in the ocean. And before you picture a dramatic moment where a robot reaches an untouched trench and discovers something totally new, a big part of this story is actually less flashy than that. A lot of these new creatures weren't five-mouthed because someone finally reached some impossible corner of the deep. Many of them were already collected years ago. They were preserved and stored in museums and research collections, labeled with dates and locations, and then left sitting there because nobody had officially identified and described them yet. That's the strange reality. A species can be physically in our possession and still be basically invisible to science, policy, and conservation until it's properly recognized. The ocean quietly holds up a lot of modern life. It feeds billions of people. It absorbs a huge share of the heat and carbon we put into the atmosphere. It shapes weather patterns that affect farms, cities, shipping routes, and entire economies. Even if you live far inland and never think about the sea, you're still connected to what happens out there. And we don't just depend on the ocean. We actively use it. We navigate it. We pull resources from it. And we make treaties and international decisions based on what we think is living under the surface. Problem is, that picture is way less complete than most people assume. We are trying to manage an ocean we barely know. Less than 1,000th of the seafloor has ever been seen directly by scientists. So when we talk about protection, regulation, conservation zones, environmental impact, and who gets to use which parts of the ocean, it all runs into one uncomfortable question. How do you protect, regulate, and share a world when you don't even know who lives in it? A lot of the ocean's secrets aren't only hiding in trenches and canyons. They're also hiding in places that feel almost ordinary. Museum basements and storage rooms. Shelves like these hold animals collected during expeditions decades ago, carefully preserved in jars and drawers. Many of them have detailed labels, coordinates, dates, depth, but then there's often a word that stops the story cold. Undetermined. It's basically the scientific version of saying, we have it, but we don't know what it is yet. Turning undetermined into an official species is slow, technical work. Taxonomists, the specialists who identify and formally describe species, have to examine the specimen closely, sometimes dissecting it, scanning tiny structures under microscopes, sequencing DNA, and comparing everything against records that go back centuries. Then they write a formal description in a standardized way so other scientists can verify it, and it has to be published properly. On average, that whole process takes about 13.5 years from the moment an animal is first collected to the moment it's officially described. And that delay isn't just an academic inconvenience. During those years, an unnamed species can decline. Its habitat can be damaged, or it can disappear, without ever being formally recognized in the way that science, conservation planning, and law typically require. If it's not officially documented, it's much easier for it to be ignored, even if it plays an important role in its ecosystem. In the early 2000s, there was a major attempt to confront this problem. A massive international project called the Census of Marine Life. Over 10 years, thousands of scientists worked across oceans, from polar seas to the deep abyss, mapping what was there. They uncovered thousands of potential new species and formally described over 1,000. It was a huge step forward, but it also made something very clear. The gap between what's out there and what we've officially named is still enormous. Even today, only around 250,000 marine species have been described, while some studies suggest the real number in the ocean could be 1 million or more. So for a huge portion of ocean life, the honest answer is still, we don't know what it is, and it doesn't have a name. In 2023, a new effort launched to speed that whole process up at a global scale. Japan's Nippon Foundation and the UK-based Nekton Foundation started the Ocean Census, aiming to discover 100,000 new marine species as fast as possible. It's built as a coordinated push across the world, connecting more than 1,000 researchers in over 80 countries and hundreds of institutes, people doing deep-sea work, reef surveys, lab analysis, and also the museum experts who know what's sitting in collections waiting to be understood. On May 19, 2026, the Ocean Census team announced something that really stood out. Between April 1st, 2025 and March 31st, 2026, they logged 1,121 species that were previously unknown to science. They also said this represents a 54% jump in the annual rate at which new marine species are being identified. That's not a small increase. It's a sign that the system for finding and confirming new species can move faster when the right pieces are connected. They got there through 13 expeditions in 1 year, aimed at some of the least explored parts of the ocean, and through 9 intensive species discovery workshops where experts gathered to examine specimens together. But the bigger point isn't just that they traveled to hard-to-reach places. It's that they worked on the bottleneck, getting from, "We think this might be new," to, "The world can actually see this organism exists," without waiting a decade. So what did they find? In dark waters off Japan, around 800 meters down, they found a glass sponge, an animal with a delicate structure made of silica that looks like a lattice anchored to volcanic rock. Inside that sponge, they found something nobody had documented before, a new kind of polychaete bristleworm. It's almost transparent, and it appears to live in a symbiotic partnership with the sponge. The sponge provides shelter, and the worm cleans the surface and may even help it feed. It's a good reminder that in the deep sea, habitat can be another living creature, and a single discovery can actually be multiple stories layered together. Off Australia, in the Coral Sea Marine Park, they recorded a new species of chimaera. Chimeras aren't true sharks, but they're related. Their lineage split from sharks and rays nearly 400 million years ago, which is why people often call them ghost sharks. This was a deep-sea species now recognized as new, adding another piece to a group that's ancient and still not fully understood. In the waters of Timor-Leste, they found a ribbon worm, slender, only about an inch long, with bright stripes that look almost painted on. Those colors aren't just there to look interesting. They signal chemical defenses, basically advertising that this animal isn't safe to mess with. And that connects to something bigger, because compounds from related ribbon worms are already being studied as possible treatments for diseases like Alzheimer's and schizophrenia. That's not saying this exact worm is a medicine, but it shows why documenting these animals matters. The ocean is full of chemistry we haven't even cataloged yet, and you can't seriously study what you haven't identified. Then, far deeper, in the North Trench of the South Sandwich Islands, scientists encountered a carnivorous sponge nicknamed the death ball. It's shaped like a drifting sphere of tissue, and its surface has microscopic hook-like structures that snag tiny crustaceans. Once something gets caught, the sponge slowly envelops and digests it. It's a sponge, something most people imagine as passive, acting like a slow-motion predator. Deep-sea life doesn't always fit our expectations, and that's kind of the point. And those are just a few examples. The year's discoveries also included a dwarf goby fish on remote Australian reefs, shrimp with vivid orange bands in a cave near Marseille, a luminous sea pen in the South Sandwich Islands, and entire groups of newly recorded corals, crabs, sea urchins, and sea anemones. None of these are alien in the sci-fi sense. They're Earth species that have been part of ocean ecosystems this entire time. And we're only now catching up with the fact that they exist as distinct forms of life. Now here's the part that really explains how they got to 1,121 so quickly. Most of these new species didn't come from dramatic new dives. Out of the 1,121, a total of 728 were found by going back through specimens that were already sitting in museum and research collections. Some of those were gathered more than a decade ago and were basically waiting their turn. So yes, exploration matters, but so does follow-through. A huge part of the frontier was simply working through what we already had, with the right experts and the right tools to confirm what was new. The Ocean Census approach is still built on classic science, collecting, sorting, comparing, and describing, but they's not trying to make it move more like a coordinated system instead of isolated pockets of work. Expeditions bring back animals, photos, videos, and preserved specimens. Then sorting teams and workshops bring specialists together, so the right eyes see the right organisms early, instead of samples sitting for years before they reach the one person qualified to identify them. After that, careful documentation, high-resolution imaging, measurements, CT scans when needed, and genetic barcodes creates a digital record that other researchers can examine and verify without physically handling the original specimen. Then comes the careful comparison work, which is where looks different becomes is different. Experts check global databases and museum collections, looking for details that can be surprisingly specific. Differences in anatomy, structure, and genetic patterns. Sometimes a suspected new species turns out to be something already described long ago. Other times, the evidence holds up, and multiple experts agree. This organism doesn't match anything on record. This is where the biggest process change shows up. Traditionally, a species doesn't really become visible to the wider world until the full official description is published, and that can take more than a decade. Ocean Census and its partners introduced a recognized status, discovered, and they record that immediately on an open access platform called NOVA, built specifically for new marine species. Once an expert validates it, the images and data can go online quickly, along with a provisional name, so other scientists, conservation groups, and decision-makers can see it exists without waiting years for this formal journal description. The rigorous, peer-reviewed description still happens and still matters, but NOVA brings the visibility forward from a 5-year delay to something much closer to weeks. That speed matters in the real world. For conservation and international law, you can't plan effectively if you don't know what's out there. New species information feeds into global efforts like the UN High Seas Treaty on Biodiversity, beyond national jurisdiction, and the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, both of which rely on knowing what lives where in the ocean to design protected areas and track progress. If a creature isn't recognized, it's much harder to protect on paper. It also matters for industry. As interest grows in deep-sea mining and other extractive activities, countries are expected to assess environmental impacts before operations begin. And to do that, you need a baseline, a clear picture of what's already living in the area. Without that, disturbance could wipe out species that, legally speaking, were never even acknowledged. It matters for technology and medicine too. The ocean is packed with biochemical strategies, toxins, enzymes that work under crushing pressure and low temperatures, pigments, proteins that glow in the dark, the striped ribbon worms, the carnivorous sponges, and the microbes living on and around them could all hold clues relevant to future drugs, materials, or industrial processes. Naming a species isn't the end of that path, but it's the first step that makes deeper research possible. There's also another layer happening quietly in the background. Large, organized image and data libraries like NOVA can become training material for artificial intelligence. Tools like that can help researchers flag unusual organisms in video footage, suggest possible relationships, and even point to places where similar species might be found. So this isn't just 1,121 names added to a list. It's also building a foundation for faster discovery later. But the most surprising takeaway from this record-breaking year isn't really about technology. It's about perspective. Most of these species didn't suddenly appear. They were always there. Many were simply overlooked, either because they lived in places we assumed were nearly empty, like abyssal plains and cold trenches, or because the specimens were already collected but stuck in a backlog. The bottleneck wasn't the ocean running out of surprises. It was our limited attention and the slow pace of turning specimens into official, usable knowledge. We spend billions searching for life on Mars and beyond, and that's a worthwhile scientific quest. But leaders of the Ocean Census have pointed out that discovering the majority of life in our own ocean would cost a fraction of that, and it could change how we feed ourselves, treat disease, and stabilize the climate. So the real question isn't whether we can afford to do this kind of work. It's whether we can afford not to, especially while human activity is changing ocean habitats faster than we've at. Renaming what actually lives there. Because beyond policy and technology, Something simple is happening here. Every time a species gets officially recognized, whether it's a chimaera in the deep, a carnivorous death ball sponge, or a nearly transparent worm living inside a glass sponge, it's a reminder that our picture of the world has been incomplete. You're not just adding a name to a database, you're correcting the map of life that we use to make decisions. So in the end, the story of 1,121 new ocean species in 1 year isn't only about breaking records. It's proof that the map of life in the ocean is still being built, right now. The ocean isn't an empty blue background. It's a living network of organisms we'd foove. At the same time, our choices are shaping what survives. If we choose to name these species and actually see them and record them, we give ourselves a better chance to protect them. Realistically, learning how to protect ocean life is also part of learning how to protect ourselves.